Let me ask you something. How many times have you died in a game and immediately thought, that should not have happened? You pressed the key, you were sure you pressed it, but the game registered it half a second too late, and now you're staring at a respawn screen wondering what went wrong. Or maybe you're not a gamer at all. Maybe you just type for a living, and every keyboard you've ever bought has felt kind of fine, functional, forgettable, like it was built to a price point. Rather than built to actually be good, there's a company out of the Netherlands that looked at both of those problems and decided the keyboard industry had been doing things the same mediocre way for too long. They didn't come from a massive corporation with shareholders and quarterly targets. They were two guys who were genuinely frustrated with what was available, who understood the engineering well enough to know it could be done better, and who were stubborn enough to actually go and do it. That company is Wooting. And today, we're going inside how they build their keyboards, why the technology inside them is fundamentally different from almost everything else on the market, and why competitive gamers and keyboard enthusiasts around the world have turned this small Dutch brand into one of the most talked about names in the industry. So first, a quick bit of background. Wooting was founded by Calder Limmen and Jeroen Petrus, two people who came at this from the perspective of actual users rather than manufacturers. They weren't trying to build the cheapest keyboard that would still sell. They were trying to build the keyboard they actually wanted to use themselves and couldn't find anywhere. That sounds like something every startup says. But in Wooting's case, the technology they built to solve their own problem turned out to be genuinely ahead of what the big brands were offering. And the keyboard community noticed pretty quickly. The company is still small compared to the giants of the industry. They don't have Logitech's marketing budget or Razer's retail presence. What they have instead is a product that does something mechanically and functionally different from the competition, and a community of users who understand exactly what that difference means and why it matters. To understand why Wooting keyboards are built the way they are, you first need to understand how a normal keyboard switch actually works. Because most people have never thought about this, and it's actually pretty interesting. Your standard mechanical keyboard switch, the kind you'll find in most gaming keyboards and enthusiast boards, works on a physical contact system. Inside the switch, there's a spring and a small metal leaf. When you press the key down far enough, that metal leaf makes contact with a circuit, and the keystroke registers. It's simple, it's reliable, and it's been the dominant technology for decades. But it has a fundamental limitation that's baked into the physics of how it works. Because the contact is physical, there's only one point in the key's travel where it registers. You press down to a fixed depth, the contact is made, the input is sent. And critically, there's only one point on the way back up, where the switch resets and becomes ready to register the next press. That reset point is always slightly higher up than the actuation point on the way down, and the gap between those 2 points is called hysteresis. In everyday typing, it doesn't matter much, but in competitive gaming, especially in fast-paced first-person shooters, where you might be tapping a movement key dozens of times per second, that gap is real, it's measurable, and it costs you time. Wooting's answer to this was to throw out the contact system entirely and replace it with something that doesn't have any physical contact at all. Inside a Wooting keyboard, each key uses what's called a Hall effect sensor. Instead of a metal leaf making contact with a circuit, there's a small magnet embedded in the switch stem, and a sensor underneath it that measures the strength of the magnetic field. As the key moves down, the magnet gets closer to the sensor, the field strength changes, and the sensor reads exactly how far down the key has traveled, at every single point in its travel, not just at one fixed threshold. This is called analog input, and it changes what a keyboard can actually do in a pretty significant way. Because the sensor is reading a continuous value, rather than a simple on or off, Wooting keyboards can be set to actuate at any depth you choose. You can set it to register at 0.5 millimeter of travel if you want incredibly sensitive inputs. You can set it deeper if you want to avoid accidental presses. You can even assign different actuation depths to different keys, so your movement keys behave differently from your ability keys, which competitive players use more than you might expect. But the feature that really made the keyboard world sit up and pay attention is something called rapid trigger. Here's the problem with traditional switches that rapid trigger solves. When you're pressing and releasing a movement key very quickly, the switch has to physically travel back up past its reset point before it can register the next press. That reset point is fixed. You can't change it. It's determined by the mechanics of the switch. So there's always a minimum amount of upward travel required before the key is ready to fire again. With Hall effect sensors reading the position continuously, Wooting was able to implement something different. Rapid trigger means the key resets the instant it starts moving back up, even by a fraction of a millimeter. You don't have to wait for it to reach a fixed reset point. The moment it changes direction, even slightly, it's ready to register the next press. And when it starts going back down again, even slightly, the input fires. In practical terms, for a game like Counter-Strike 2, where stopping your movement instantly before taking a shot is one of the core mechanical skills. This is the difference between your character stopping when you intend for it to stop versus stopping slightly after. At the highest levels of play, that delay is the difference between hitting the shot and missing it. Which is exactly why so many professional and semi-professional players moved to Wooting keyboards the moment they became available. Now, the Hall effect switches that make all of this possible. Wooting calls these the lekker switches. Lekker being a Dutch word that roughly translates to good or tasty in everyday usage, which is a very Dutch thing to name a keyboard switch. But the name is kind of fitting, because these switches are engineered to a standard that most switch manufacturers simply don't try to match, because there's no physical contact happening inside the switch. There's no contact bounce. Traditional switches have a problem where the metal leaf physically bounces a tiny bit when it makes contact. And keyboard firmware has to account for this with debounce algorithms that add a small delay to filter out false inputs. Hall effect switches don't bounce. There's nothing to bounce, the sensor just reads the magnetic field, and that's it. Wooting can run much shorter debounce times as a result, which contributes directly to how responsive the keyboard feels. The lifespan is also in a completely different category. Traditional mechanical switches are generally rated to somewhere between 50 and 100 million key presses before the contact starts to degrade. Lekker switches, because there's no contact to degrade, are rated at a significantly higher cycle count. The switch doesn't wear out in the same way, because the mechanism that's doing the work, the magnetic field and the sensor, has no moving parts rubbing against each other and no metal contact points eroding over time. The build quality of the keyboard itself is another area where Wooting makes decisions that you notice immediately when you pick one up. The cases are aluminum, which matters for a few reasons that go beyond just aesthetics. Aluminum is stiffer than plastic, so it doesn't flex when you're typing hard. That flex in a plastic case creates a slightly mushy, inconsistent feel that you might not consciously notice until you use a board that doesn't have it, and then you can't unfeel it. Aluminum also damps vibration better, contributing to a quieter, more satisfying sound profile when typing. The PCB design inside a Wooting board is also done with more care than you'd find in a typical mass-market keyboard. The sensor placement, the routing of signals, the quality of the components used around the Hall effect sensors. All of that determines how accurately and consistently the sensor readings translate into actual key inputs. Wooting publishes the polling rate and input latency data for their boards, which is something most keyboard companies quietly avoid doing because the numbers aren't always flattering. One thing that sets Wooting apart as a company, not just as a product, is how directly they communicate with the people who use their keyboards. Their firmware and software, which they call wootility, gets updated based on direct feedback from the community. Rapid Trigger itself was actually implemented as a firmware feature after users asked for it, not as something that was planned from the start. The company was small enough and agile enough to look at what their community was asking for, understand the engineering behind it, and ship it. That kind of feedback loop between a manufacturer and its users is almost non-existent in the consumer electronics industry at scale. And it's a big part of why Wooting has the reputation it does. The keyboards go through quality testing before shipping that focuses heavily on sensor consistency. Because the entire value proposition of the keyboard depends on those Hall effect sensors reading accurately and reliably. Each board needs to be checked to ensure that every key sensor is calibrated correctly and responding consistently across its full range of travel. A key that reads slightly differently than its neighbor is a problem in a way that a misaligned keycap simply isn't. So here's the thing. Most people are going to look at a Wooting keyboard and see a slab of aluminum with keys on it that costs more than they expected to spend. And on the surface, that's fair. You can get a keyboard for $20 that also has keys and also types words. But what you're actually paying for with a Wooting board is a completely different approach to what a keyboard switch can be. You're paying for sensors instead of contacts, for analog position data instead of a binary on or off signal, For a reset mechanism that responds to the physics of the key's movement rather than a fixed mechanical threshold. And for firmware that actually takes advantage of all of that in ways that are directly useful to how you use a keyboard every day. Whether you're a competitive player who wants every possible advantage that the hardware can give you, or you're someone who just types a lot and has finally decided that your keyboard deserves to be something you actually enjoy using rather than something you tolerate, Wooting built this thing for you, both of you. And honestly, in an industry that's been selling you the same basic contact switch design for 40 years and calling it innovation when they add RGB lighting, that's worth paying attention to. If this one was interesting to you, hit subscribe because we go this deep every single week, and drop a comment below. Are you a Wooting user already? A skeptic? Or somewhere in between? I genuinely want to know.